I called the plumber over a trivial matter, or so it seemed to me then. The pipe in the kitchen was leaking quietly, almost guiltily, as if apologizing for its existence. During the day, the sound was lost among the ordinary, but at night it became intrusive, as if someone invisible was reminding me of itself again and again. I put off calling for a long time. At my age, we know how to endure. First, we endure the cold in our hands, then the emptiness in the house, then such trifles that one day suddenly turn out to be the last straw. That day, I woke up with the feeling that if I didn't do it now, the house would finally cease to be my ally. He came in the afternoon, calm, polite, not too talkative. He took off his shoes at the threshold, as if afraid to disturb my silence. I caught myself thinking strangely. I hadn't heard someone else's breathing in the apartment for a long time. Even that seemed unusual. He worked silently, and I sat at the kitchen table, listening to him move, to open the cabinets, to the dripping of water that stopped for a second. And it was at that moment that the silence suddenly became frightening. Because when the noise suddenly disappears, you're left alone with yourself. He spoke unexpectedly, without turning around, as if the words had slipped out of his mouth. He asked if I had access to the attic. The word rang heavy. Attic. I hadn't been up there in years. They put away things they no longer want to see, but feel sorry to throw away. They send the past there, to wait. I didn't answer right away. It seemed to me that the stairs up had suddenly become higher than before. We climbed slowly. The steps creaked like old joints, and every sound echoed inside me. My heart was beating a little faster than usual, and I couldn't understand why. I wasn't afraid of anything. At least, that's what I wanted to think. But when we stopped just under the ceiling, the plumber looked at me strangely, not with fear, but with a kind of cautious pity. And then he quietly said that it seemed the problem wasn't in the pipe at all. The attic greeted us with heavy, warm air. It's always like that there, as if the past breathes more slowly than the present. Dust hung in the beam of light. The plumber directed his flashlight forward, and every particle seemed motionless, as if afraid to move and disturb the peace. I paused on the last step and suddenly found myself reluctant to take the next one. Not because I was scared. No. Because it was familiar. Too familiar. I hadn't been up here in a long time, but the attic recognized me immediately. The smell of old wood, cardboard, dry rags, and something else, elusive, homely. That's the smell of time that's in no hurry to pass. I remembered how I used to come up here with my husband, still young, still convinced that everything in life was understandable and explicable. Back then, we'd laughed as we rearranged boxes, made plans, argued about what to throw out and what to save for later. Then came the time, and much of it remained here. The plumber walked forward, pushing aside several boxes, carefully, as if afraid of damaging something with his movements, not just his hands. He was silent, and that silence weighed more heavily than any words. I looked at his back and suddenly felt a strange tension rise inside me, as if I was about to hear something I'd long been preparing for, but never wanted to hear. He stopped at the far wall, crouched down, turned on the flashlight again, and pointed it downward. I walked closer, trying not to breathe too loudly. A pipe appeared in the beam of light. A new one, completely different from the others, clean, unmarked, neatly secured. It ran along the wall, hidden behind the beams, and disappeared into the floor. I stared at it for a long time. Too long. Sometimes the eyes see before the mind can process. I suddenly felt cold, even though the attic was stuffy. The plumber said this pipe wasn't part of the old system, that it had been laid later, much later. He spoke calmly, professionally, as if he were explaining something mundane. But my insides clenched, because along with his words, memories floated into my head. Not clear, not distinct, but fragments.
Conversacions sirvet. Razasidu barluka.
Visits that seemed random. Help I hadn't asked for. I remembered how a few years ago my son had insisted on renovations. He said it would be better this way. More convenient. More reliable. I'd agreed then the way older people agree, not because they understand everything, but because they trust. Because they want to believe that children know best. I remembered how he'd avoided looking me in the eye when he talked about the workers. How he'd said everything was already paid for, that I had nothing to worry about. I stood in the attic and suddenly realized that the anxiety had always been there. I'd simply learned to ignore it. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. The plumber asked if I knew where the pipe led. I said no, and that was true. But somewhere deep down, I already had a hunch. Sometimes the truth comes not as a revelation, but as confirmation of something you've long felt but were afraid to name. He said the pipe led to one of the rooms. Not the kitchen, not the bathroom, but the living area. The words sounded strange, almost unreal. I felt my knees go weak, and I leaned against an old beam. The wood was warm, reliable. It had withstood decades. I suddenly wanted to be like him. I asked if I could check. He nodded. We descended in silence. The stairs creaked louder than before, or so it seemed. Every step echoed in my chest. I thought about how strange life works. Sometimes one call, made over nothing, brings to the surface what had been hidden for years. We walked down the hallway. He stopped at the door to the very room I rarely used. The guest room. The room where my son and his family had once slept, where my grandson's crib had later stood, where now I kept things just in case. I rarely went there. Too many memories. Too much silence. He turned on the faucet, and I heard something echo in the wall. Not loudly, but distinctly, like an answer to a question that had been hanging in the air for a long time. I closed my eyes. I didn't need to look to understand. There was no anger in me at that moment.
No screaming.
There was a strange, deep disappointment, not even in the children, in myself, in how easily I'd let them decide for me, how often I'd said, "Oh well," when I should have asked, "Why?" The plumber said that everything had been done correctly technically, that it wasn't an accident, that it was the system. His words sounded distant, but there was caution in them, as if he understood that he was talking not about pipes, but about someone's life. I thanked him and asked him to give me some time. He nodded, said he'd be downstairs if needed. When he left, the house was filled with silence again. But this was a different silence. It no longer lulled me. It demanded an answer. I sat in that same room, on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for a long time. I thought about how many times in my life I'd chosen not to ask questions, about how convenient it was to be trusting, about how painful it was to realize that trust had been used not for evil, but for convenience. I didn't want to cry. Tears would have been too easy a way out. I simply sat and breathed, trying to wrap my head around a new truth. Sometimes the truth doesn't destroy a home. It simply reveals that life there has long been different from what you thought. And then I realized, this isn't the end. This is only the beginning of a conversation I'd been putting off for too long. After the plumber left, the house seemed to grow larger. Or, conversely, I felt smaller, it's hard to say. The space between the walls filled not with air, but with thoughts. They didn't rush about, didn't shout, didn't demand immediate decisions. They simply were, like guests who can't be sent away because they've come on business. I sat in that room for a long time, a room that, as it turned out, had a life of its own. I stared at the wall and tried to remember the last time something had changed there, the last time I asked questions, the last time I ceased to be the mistress not only of this house, but also of my own decisions. Memory, like an old box, doesn't open right away.
First, the little things.
Then, the things that had been carefully pushed aside. I remembered how my son had once told me I shouldn't go up to the attic. It's dangerous there, Mom. How he had suggested I do everything myself. How I felt relief then, and at the same time, a strange regret that I couldn't explain. I remembered how he'd rushed when he arrived, how he'd talk about expenses, about bills, about how everyone has it this way these days. And I'd agreed again and again, because it was easier, because I didn't want to be heavy, because old age teaches us to be comfortable. I walked through the house slowly, as if checking to see if he was still there. I touched the table, the windowsill, the door frames. Everything was familiar. Everything was mine. And yet, somewhere deep inside, there was a growing feeling that part of my life was flowing alongside me, without my participation. Like that pipe, neatly hidden from view. I didn't call right away. The phone was nearby, but I didn't pick it up. Conversations that can change everything shouldn't be entered into unprepared. I knew this from experience. Words spoken too early often hurt more than the truth spoken at the right time. I made tea. I spent a long time choosing a cup. In moments like these, little things suddenly become important. They provide support. While the water boiled, I stood by the window and looked out onto the street. People went about their business, unaware that in one of the houses, an elderly woman was looking at her life for the first time in years without the usual shroud of trust. I wasn't afraid. It surprised me. I expected pain, anger, resentment. But instead, clarity came. Quiet, almost cold. Like the morning air that first nibbles your skin and then invigorates. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. I thought about my son, about how little he was, how he held my hand when he was afraid of the dark, about how I told him then that home is a place where you're always safe. And suddenly I realized that he might have been trying to do the same. In his own way, without asking, without explaining, making decisions for me. This thought didn't justify him, but it helped me understand. I sat down at the table and finally picked up the phone. I dialed the number, paused, hung up, then dialed again. My heart beat steadily, as if it knew the conversation would happen anyway, and there was no point in rushing it. He didn't answer right away. There was his usual cheerfulness in his voice, but now I heard tension beneath it. We talked about small things, about the weather, about how he was doing. He asked if I needed anything. I almost smiled. How often do we say, "Call me if anything happens," hoping that if anything won't happen? I said the plumber was in today. There was a short pause. Very short, but long enough for me to understand. He quickly composed himself and began to explain, saying it was a routine inspection, that it was nothing serious. I listened and didn't interrupt. Let him finish. People need to be given the opportunity to hear their own words. When he fell silent, I said calmly, almost softly, that we needed to talk. Not over the phone, not casually, but for real. He agreed too quickly. That was also an answer. We agreed for tomorrow. The rest of the day passed strangely. I went about my daily business, but every movement was filled with new meaning. I no longer pretended nothing was happening. I allowed myself to know, and it wasn't as scary as I thought. I slept poorly that night, not because of anxiety, because of anticipation. Sometimes anticipation takes more energy than the event itself. I lay in the dark and thought about how often we put off conversations because we're afraid of losing love. But perhaps true love begins precisely where honesty begins. In the morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet. The pipe no longer dripped. That sound disappeared, as if giving way to something more important. I tidied myself up, put on a clean dress, and carefully styled my hair. Not for him, for myself, because that day I wanted to feel grounded. When he arrived, I opened the door immediately. He walked in and looked around as if he was seeing this house for the first time. Or perhaps for the first time, he understood what he meant to me. We sat down at the table. I didn't offer tea. Some conversations are better started without the usual rituals. I told him about the chimney, about the attic, about what I'd learned. I spoke calmly, without accusations. The words came slowly but precisely. I didn't ask why. I asked for what purpose. Those are different questions. He listened, his head bowed. Occasionally he'd look up, as if he wanted to say something, but then he remained silent. When I finished, silence fell over the room. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a silence in which the truth had finally found its place. And at that moment, I realized that the most difficult step lay ahead. Not the clarification, not the explanation, but the decision that I would have to make myself. He sat across from me, and suddenly I saw in him not a grown man, not a son accustomed to making decisions for others, but the boy who once hid behind my back. Only now he was hiding not from the darkness, but from responsibility. I didn't rush him. At such moments, words spoken prematurely can destroy what can still be preserved. He didn't begin to speak right away. First, he sighed, ran his hand over his face, as if wiping away the fatigue. Then he said he meant well, that he was afraid I couldn't cope alone, that he thought he was taking care of me when he made decisions for me. He spoke for a long time, haltingly, returning to the same words, as if trying to convince himself, not me. I listened and suddenly caught myself thinking a strange thought. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is when you're not heard. But he heard you now, truly, and that changed everything. I told him that caring isn't about hiding. Caring is when they ask, when they give you a choice, even if it's inconvenient. I said it wasn't the pipe, the attic, the money, or the control that hurt me. It was the fact that my life was still considered temporary. As if, at my age, decisions could be made without me, because it's easier.
He looked up at me.
There wasn't justification in his eyes, but shame. Quiet, mature. The kind that doesn't demand punishment. He admitted he was afraid of my refusal. Afraid that I'd say no, and he wouldn't be able to overcome his own fears. That I'd prove stronger than he thought. And then it became clear to me, All this time, he wasn't protecting me. He was protecting himself from the thought that I was still alive, living a real life, with my own decisions. We talked for a long time,
A very long time.
about money, about the house, about the future, but most importantly, about boundaries. That even old age doesn't cancel the right to be heard. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. There was a clarity within me I hadn't felt in years. At some point, he asked what I wanted to do next. The question sounded hesitant, as if he were afraid of the answer. And I realized that this moment was worth going up to the attic for. I said I wanted to decide for myself how to live, that I wanted to know everything about my home, that I wasn't going to refuse help, but I also wouldn't allow decisions to be made behind my back. I spoke simply,
No ultimatums.
but every word was final. He nodded, slowly, and there was more agreement in that nod than in any promise. When he left, the house was filled with silence again. But now it was different. There were no hidden pipes. There were no unspoken words. I walked through the rooms and suddenly felt a strange lightness. It was as if the house was mine again, not just in name, but in feel. I climbed up to the attic again, this time alone. I stood there, in the dust and warm air, and realized attics aren't meant to hide things. They're meant to one day rise up and see everything. After that conversation, life didn't become perfect. No one came to apologize every day. No one changed overnight. But something important did shift. I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. I started asking questions, calmly, without fear of appearing inconvenient. And it turned out that the world didn't collapse because of this. On the contrary, it became more honest. My son started visiting differently, not with ready-made solutions, but with questions, sometimes awkward, sometimes cautious. I could see that he was having a hard time, but I no longer took on his discomfort. Every adult has a right to their feelings. We tidied up the attic together, not all at once,
Slowly.
sorting through things, reminiscing, laughing, and sometimes falling silent. We threw out things that had long since ceased to be useful, and this turned out to be symbolic, and not just for the house. Sometimes I still hear water dripping at night, but now I get up and check. I don't wait. I can't stand it. I no longer put life on hold. I've realized one important thing. Loneliness doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes we invite it in when we stop defending our place. And returning to ourselves begins with a simple step, a question. What do I want? The plumber never knew that his routine call was the beginning for me. He simply did his job. But sometimes it's the little things like these that change everything, because the truth rarely comes with a bang. More often, it rises quietly up the creaky stairs straight to our attic. And if one day you feel like something in your life is happening too quietly and unnoticed, perhaps it's time to rise and see, while the truth is still close, while it waits.